So I'll introduce myself. I'm Jane Goulding. I'm the chair of British in Europe. And for those of you who don't know us, British in Europe is a coalition of 10 core groups of UK citizens living in the EU 27 with a membership of around 35,000 people. And we work very closely with our colleagues, the 3 million, who represent the largest group of EU citizens in the UK. As far as British in Europe are concerned, there are approximately 1.2 million British in Europe, and 70 to 80% of us are of working age or younger, and economically active across the EU 27, and around 20% are pensioners in Spain and elsewhere. So a very large number are working age or younger. We're all Europeans, children of the European project with our colleagues from the 3 million. Brexit is not something we ever wanted, and the majority of British in Europe, as well as the 3 million, had no vote in the referendum. We estimate over 60% even of the British in Europe did not have the right to vote. But we put our faith in you and the EU to protect our rights, and we welcomed the principal approach that the EU took in the negotiating directives and the essential principles on citizens' rights. The negotiations began, and inevitably, this resulted in the worsening of the position on citizens' rights, given the counter-proposal of the UK and the compromises that then ensued. At this point, to be honest, we have no great faith in the UK to defend our rights, as we believe that their aim now is to proceed to the second phase of the negotiations, withdrawal negotiations. Indeed, we feel they have been pushing back into that territory for much of the first phase. So we now rely on the EU and you to realise that the UK approach to the negotiations is leading to a race to the bottom, which is to a sort of UK plus and EU minus. In other words, a slightly improved UK proposal and a worsening of the EU proposal. And to recognise that if sufficient progress is confirmed in December based on the current direction of the negotiations, the stated objective that Brexit should not affect the daily lives of the 3 million and British in Europe will not be achieved, unfortunately. The current position as we understand it to be, and we do appreciate that things are moving very fast at the moment on a weekly basis or faster, the current position is that, first of all, there will be no proper protection of the existing rights of EU citizens in the UK at the current state of the negotiations. Minor adjustments to administrative procedures will not detract from the fundamental position that EU citizens will be applying for a new lesser status in an environment that is hostile to immigration in the UK. There is also now a threat, given reciprocity, that this race to the bottom may be joined by some EU countries applying similar reasoning and immigration procedures to British in Europe. What we have at the moment, as far as EU citizens is concerned, the offer on the table is not declaratory of their rights, but conditional. They must make an application in order to achieve the new status. The second point is that continuing free movement across the EU for both groups through a lifelong right of return for EU citizens to the UK and continuing free movement rights across the EU 27 for UK citizens across the EU will not be preserved at the current state of the negotiations. And the knock-on effect of this for professional qualifications and economic rights affecting both groups, so that some professional qualifications won't even be recognised, and those recognised plus economic rights will be limited to the country of residence. There will also be limitations on family reunification rights in the UK for both groups, both for EU citizens in the UK and returning UK citizens to the UK who have used their rights of free movement and thus have rights under EU law when they return to the UK at the moment. The EU's positions on behalf of the EU 27 on free movement, professional qualifications and economic rights are particularly difficult to understand at the moment, as they would prejudice EU citizens in the UK. The stance on recognition of qualifications will stop EU citizens living in the UK who have UK qualifications from having them recognised if they return to their home country post-Brexit. And the EU has to date not accepted a UK offer that would ensure that EU citizens living in the UK have a lifelong right to return to the UK if they have to leave for an extended period, for example, for a job posting or in order to go and look after a sick or elderly relative in their home country. And yet, in our view, all of this can be reversed. The negotiating directives and essential principles that the EU agreed are wide enough to allow this, as paragraph 20 of the negotiating directives set out to protect, and I quote, the status and rights derived from union law at the withdrawal date, including those the enjoyment of which will intervene at a later date, for example, rights related to old age pensions, as well as rights which are in the process of being obtained. And the essential principles on citizens' rights are even clearer, stating that the same level of protection as set out in union law at the date of withdrawal of EU 27 citizens in the UK and of UK nationals in the EU 27 should be ensured. In other words, existing rights pre-withdrawal of the protected group of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU. What is more, on top of this, going back to the free movement issue, protection of free movement rights is also specifically referred to in the negotiating directives in paragraph 21. And this was not in the original draft, but was added in the final version. So what we ask is that there should only be a finding of sufficient progress on citizens' rights when all of these fundamental issues have been resolved. Otherwise, the rights of people will be just one issue among many others in the second phase, and the likelihood of a comprehensive agreement in line with the aspirations that were set out in the negotiating directives and the essential principles will be significantly diminished. And when the comprehensive agreement is reached, it should be ring-fenced, or at least there should be a safeguard clause in there, so that it's ring-fenced from the rest of the negotiations and should stand whatever the outcome of the other negotiations on other priorities in the withdrawal agreement. But enough of the legal points. What of the social and human dimension to all of this, recently renewed in Gothenburg? As I said, we are children of the European project, a project at its heart of peace, solidarity and cooperation, a social project. That is what my British father, who aged 20 was at Belsen 2 days after its liberation, and my German father-in-law, who aged 16 survived the bombing of Dresden, hoped for their children and for their grandchildren. We are the citizens who have seized all the opportunities that EU citizenship and the fundamental freedoms have given us and taken them far beyond what the founding fathers dreamt of. The solidarity and community of our two groups, the 3 million and the British in Europe, caught up in this unprecedented situation, is the expression of the European project, a community of Europeans who have together set aside our differences of nationality and culture and see only our similarities and our joint fight to defend our citizenship rights. If you disappoint us now, you quash our hopes and dreams and those of EU citizens in the future by sending a clear message that embracing EU citizenship is a risk. It can be taken away from you, and you can be penalised for embracing it. EU citizenship is our fundamental status, and it should protect us now in this unprecedented situation. And if not now, when? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My understanding is that now for the 3 million, it's probably a broader issue. My feeling is that now, as the legal services have worked on it for quite some time, and they cleared all the difficult issues, because it all was stopped by the opinions of the legal services, especially the Commission and the Council, as we know. So now we thought that this is clear, but now I think the opinions of the legal services went to political level in some of the institutions, not in the Parliament, but in other institutions, and then again the same problem with coping with it politically probably has become a hurdle for us. So definitely we have to talk to Mr. Tajani. We have to take it to the level, I think, of the presidents of the European institutions, and otherwise I don't think we can move it forward. And then you also proposed this oral question, the possibility of asking directly in the plenary session both the Council and the Commission. So I think it is a good idea also. I believe we could do it, so we will ask for it. And I don't know what else we can do at this stage. Maybe let's start with the oral question, and let's also start with the conversation with Mr. Tajani as soon as possible. Or we can maybe try to have the group of political leaders, or maybe bring it to the Conference of Presidents. I don't know. We just have to think of it, but certainly we have to take it up to that level.
Mr. Wieland me insiste mucho en...
Mr. Wieland insists very much that we look at the judicial road and see whether or not the Parliament can move towards asking the court for an opinion. I think we should at least look at it with the legal services and see if, well, with the support of the President, we can actually move that forward. I mean, Mr. Wieland really did stress that this morning. But Rainer was talking about this possibility a number of years ago, but as the committee, I don't think we can do it. But we could actually go to Mr. Tajani. Only Mr. Tajani can do it. So we can do it. But let's think a little bit. Let's start with the question, the oral question, and then the conversation with Mr. Tajani, and push a little bit forward what's happening with him. Okay, perfect.
We can close this point on our agenda. I understand there's nobody's against, no more speakers that we have. Now we have a problem, because we have our friends from on the rights of citizens who have come a little bit early, and we actually can start the discussion with you, because we envisaged it for 5:20. But it's better probably to start once you are in, and I hope that colleagues who might come later will not complain. But so what do you want? You want to wait, or you want to start now? We are happy to start. Okay. So how you are organized? I don't know who would like. So could you just take the floor in the order you yourselves decide, and say who you are, and just talk on what you would like to share with us?
We said actually we're happy to wait if you
are
prefer us to wait, because we have time.
I don't know. There is both risk that more people would go, and I don't have a guarantee that people will come. So it is a little bit risky. In this sense, we are having horrible days, so everybody is in 5 meetings at the same time. So and it is web streamed, it's recorded. So I understand. Yeah, that might be better to start.
Okay. We will start.
Sorry,
then.
Helmut?
Maybe we can wait 5 minutes, because somebody is maybe on the way already. So 5 minutes to wait and then to start immediately. Hopefully that more colleagues are joining us.
I would like to have this hope, but I'm not sure.
But don't go away.
So, okay. So actually I leave the decision to you. If you want to wait 5 minutes, we can wait. But
Yeah, but you would start, and now you're leaving it.
colleagues, you want to wait 5 minutes, or you want to start? I'm talking to our three guests, yeah? What?
They don't understand.
Okay, whatever. Yes, you know.
Start?
Okay, so you start.
Thank you very much indeed. We're happy to start now. And British in Europe will speak first, followed by our colleagues, the 3 million. Okay. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Jane Goulding. I'm the chair of British in Europe. And for those of you who don't know us, British in Europe is a coalition of 10 core groups of UK citizens living in the EU 27 with a membership of around 35,000 people. And we work very closely with our colleagues, the 3 million, who represent the largest group of EU citizens in the UK. As far as British in Europe are concerned, there are approximately 1.2 million British in Europe, and 70 to 80% of us are of working age or younger, and economically active across the EU 27, and around 20% are pensioners in Spain and elsewhere. So a very large number are working age or younger. We're all Europeans, children of the European project with our colleagues from the 3 million. Brexit is not something we ever wanted, and the majority of British in Europe, as well as the 3 million, had no vote in the referendum. We estimate over 60% even of the British in Europe did not have the right to vote. But we put our faith in you and the EU to protect our rights, and we welcomed the principal approach that the EU took in the negotiating directives and the essential principles on citizens' rights. The negotiations began, and inevitably, this resulted in the worsening of the position on citizens' rights, given the counter-proposal of the UK and the compromises that then ensued. At this point, to be honest, we have no great faith in the UK to defend our rights, as we believe that their aim now is to proceed to the second phase of the negotiations, withdrawal negotiations. Indeed, we feel they have been pushing back into that territory for much of the first phase. So we now rely on the EU and you to realise that the UK approach to the negotiations is leading to a race to the bottom, which is to a sort of UK plus and EU minus. In other words, a slightly improved UK proposal and a worsening of the EU proposal. And to recognise that if sufficient progress is confirmed in December based on the current direction of the negotiations, the stated objective that Brexit should not affect the daily lives of the 3 million and British in Europe will not be achieved, unfortunately. The current position as we understand it to be, and we do appreciate that things are moving very fast at the moment on a weekly basis or faster, the current position is that, first of all, there will be no proper protection of the existing rights of EU citizens in the UK at the current state of the negotiations. Minor adjustments to administrative procedures will not detract from the fundamental position that EU citizens will be applying for a new lesser status in an environment that is hostile to immigration in the UK. There is also now a threat, given reciprocity, that this race to the bottom may be joined by some EU countries applying similar reasoning and immigration procedures to British in Europe. What we have at the moment, as far as EU citizens is concerned, the offer on the table is not declaratory of their rights, but conditional. They must make an application in order to achieve the new status. The second point is that continuing free movement across the EU for both groups through a lifelong right of return for EU citizens to the UK and continuing free movement rights across the EU 27 for UK citizens across the EU will not be preserved at the current state of the negotiations. And the knock-on effect of this for professional qualifications and economic rights affecting both groups, so that some professional qualifications won't even be recognised, and those recognised plus economic rights will be limited to the country of residence. There will also be limitations on family reunification rights in the UK for both groups, both for EU citizens in the UK and returning UK citizens to the UK who have used their rights of free movement and thus have rights under EU law when they return to the UK at the moment. The EU's positions on behalf of the EU 27 on free movement, professional qualifications and economic rights are particularly difficult to understand at the moment, as they would prejudice EU citizens in the UK. The stance on recognition of qualifications will stop EU citizens living in the UK who have UK qualifications from having them recognised if they return to their home country post-Brexit. And the EU has to date not accepted a UK offer that would ensure that EU citizens living in the UK have a lifelong right to return to the UK if they have to leave for an extended period, for example, for a job posting or in order to go and look after a sick or elderly relative in their home country. And yet, in our view, all of this can be reversed. The negotiating directives and essential principles that the EU agreed are wide enough to allow this, as paragraph 20 of the negotiating directives set out to protect, and I quote, the status and rights derived from union law at the withdrawal date, including those the enjoyment of which will intervene at a later date, for example, rights related to old age pensions, as well as rights which are in the process of being obtained. And the essential principles on citizens' rights are even clearer, stating that the same level of protection as set out in union law at the date of withdrawal of EU 27 citizens in the UK and of UK nationals in the EU 27 should be ensured. In other words, existing rights pre-withdrawal of the protected group of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU. What is more, on top of this, going back to the free movement issue, protection of free movement rights is also specifically referred to in the negotiating directives in paragraph 21. And this was not in the original draft, but was added in the final version. So what we ask is that there should only be a finding of sufficient progress on citizens' rights when all of these fundamental issues have been resolved. Otherwise, the rights of people will be just one issue among many others in the second phase, and the likelihood of a comprehensive agreement in line with the aspirations that were set out in the negotiating directives and the essential principles will be significantly diminished. And when the comprehensive agreement is reached, it should be ring-fenced, or at least there should be a safeguard clause in there, so that it's ring-fenced from the rest of the negotiations and should stand whatever the outcome of the other negotiations on other priorities in the withdrawal agreement. But enough of the legal points. What of the social and human dimension to all of this, recently renewed in Gothenburg? As I said, we are children of the European project, a project at its heart of peace, solidarity and cooperation, a social project. That is what my British father, who aged 20 was at Belsen 2 days after its liberation, and my German father-in-law, who aged 16 survived the bombing of Dresden, hoped for their children and for their grandchildren. We are the citizens who have seized all the opportunities that EU citizenship and the fundamental freedoms have given us and taken them far beyond what the founding fathers dreamt of. The solidarity and community of our two groups, the 3 million and the British in Europe, caught up in this unprecedented situation, is the expression of the European project, a community of Europeans who have together set aside our differences of nationality and culture and see only our similarities and our joint fight to defend our citizenship rights. If you disappoint us now, you quash our hopes and dreams, and those of EU citizens in the future, by sending a clear message that embracing EU citizenship is a risk. It can be taken away from you, and you can be penalised for embracing it. EU citizenship is our fundamental status, and it should protect us now in this unprecedented situation. And if not now, when? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My understanding is that now for the 3 million, Madame Anne-Laure Donskoy would speak, right?
Good afternoon, panel. I am Anne-Laure Donskoy. I am a French citizen. I'm a European citizen, and I am the co-founder of the 3 million. The 3 million was formed in July 2016 as a response to the results of the referendum. And similarly to British in Europe, we have a membership of around 35,000. I can only reiterate what my colleague Jane Goulding from British in Europe has said, that we are all indeed children of Europe and children of the European project, active Europeans who've made this project alive. 3 million EU citizens were also excluded from the referendum of June 2016, even though many of us have been residing in the UK for decades and have established lives, paid taxes, contributed to the social and economic life of the UK in so many different ways. We too have very limited faith in the negotiations and worry that the pressure to move on to phase 2 may see compromises taking precedence over the protection of our existing rights. From the 3 million's perspective, while there has been on the surface some progress in some areas, it's clear too that many issues remain totally unsolved and with potential dire consequences for 3 million EU citizens in the UK. So where are we at now after round 6 of the negotiations? For us, there are roughly 4 areas which we would like to highlight now. The first one is constitutional, the main stumbling block here being the possibility of referring cases to the European Court of Justice. But the news last night that there may be some movement on this is potentially good news. We don't know. We'll have to wait and see if this becomes a reality and what is the framework around this. And without the oversight of the ECJ, there is a danger that there could be different interpretations of the treaty, therefore, of our rights. So coming on to rights, under the proposed so-called status, which settled status, which the UK intends to impose on EU citizens in the UK, we will lose our rights overnight, and the UK government keeps talking of rights falling away, which is quite an image, with an obligation to apply to this new lesser status with less rights. And it looks like this narrative is going to be very hard to shift. So, but on the other hand, we also regret the lack of challenge by the EU of this status. Main issues linked to this are, as Jane mentioned, but these are true as well for us, family reunification, the loss of some rights conferred on the freedom of movement. For instance, there are many projects which are funded by the EU. So at the moment, if I reside in the UK and want to take part, I can. Post-Brexit, I won't be able to. So projects, employment, this sort of thing, when it's EU-funded initiatives, this will stop being open to us. Accessing our rights via an administrative process. This is the issue of a status which is constitutive rather than declaratory. And there has been, in our eyes, the very unfortunate conflation of support for the still-to-come simplified administrative process to register 3 million EU citizens for obtaining settled status and the status itself. I mean, it is true that we have been pointing out the fact that this process is pretty horrendous, with 85 pages long and kilograms worth of documentation to provide, and also with the burden of proof being on the applicant itself. But, you know, a simplified status doesn't mean, a simplified administrative process doesn't mean a status, and the concept behind the status is right or acceptable. And indeed, the process, the administrative process, is fraught with issues which go well beyond the logistical side of things. There are examples to this as well around the new status. The application to it would mean criminality checks, conduct checks, which will cover the whole time a person has been residing in the UK. There are also issues linked to the three pillars of the Citizens Directive, so comprehensive sickness insurance, the work tests and sufficient resources. With regard to comprehensive sickness insurance and the work test, we welcome the fact that the UK government has said that they will be discounted under the new status. However, the issue of sufficient resources has not been broached in detail yet, while we know that this is being used as a basis for deportation orders. What does that mean for carers, for persons on low or irregular income, for persons with disabilities or long-term illness? What sort of protection can they hope for if this isn't clarified and soon? And then we have this hostile environment. The UK government keeps telling us that this is a non-issue, that it's a red herring. And it often uses, again, this forthcoming example of the simplified administrative process as an example of goodwill. However, at the same time, this totally ignores the many reported cases of daily incidents of increased xenophobia and harassment experienced by EU citizens in all walks of life, where there's the increased number of checks when trying to access health services, opening bank accounts, housing, the wide range data. The UK government is also doing a lot of data mining to find out where all these foreigners are and trying to check whether they have a legal status or not. It also ignores the government's own figures on hate crime, which show a very large increase of incidents in particular, since the referendum. It's very clear there are very high peaks now. And not obviously mentioning people who were murdered after the referendum last July and August. In conclusion, we, as Jane has mentioned, we do feel that there is scope in the negotiating guidelines for flexibility. And this takes us back to first-base principles, specifically the fundamental principle which seems to have got lost in all of this, that Brexit should not alter our lives because our rights should not be affected by it. We would really like to see our rights ring-fenced now so that the uncertainty that 3 million EU citizens stops now. EU citizens is the European project at the end of the day. It's about people's lives. It's not about saucepans or cars or trade deals. And as Jane has said, you know, if we don't do this now, then when? Thank you.
Thank you. The short woman would like to intervene also? No? Two are enough? Thank you. Danuta Hübner apologized, but she had a very important meeting, so as you can see, I took the presidency. Richard, do you want to speak? Yes. Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for those two excellent presentations which explained the issues both ways around, the 3 million EU citizens in Britain and the 1.2 million British citizens in the rest of the European Union, and the challenges they face. We've had presentations on this before. We're quite familiar with it, but it's good to refresh our minds, and sadly, of course, to tell us that not much progress has been made, inadequate progress has been made. It's, of course, from my point of view, as not a member of the governing party in the United Kingdom, I think it's disgraceful that the British government has made this a matter of negotiation. They could have, from the very beginning, guaranteed the existing rights of EU citizens living in the UK. The current deadlock, since they are part of the negotiation, you've been made pawns in the negotiation, which is, I think, deplorable. But in those negotiations, there is still deadlock both on issues like the right of family reunification that you mentioned, like question of linked questions like the recognitions of qualifications, and on the issue of how any deal, if it is reached, is going to be enforced. And I can quite understand why people from other member states have no confidence at the moment in the way Britain would enforce these things if it was simply a question of British law and British enforcement mechanisms, because of the sorry saga of the recent letters that were sent and then withdrawn as a terrible mistake. We didn't really mean it. But that is hardly going to inspire confidence in citizens from other member states. But even if in the coming weeks, hopefully, because maybe the phasing is actually a way to put pressure on for an agreement at this early stage. But even if there is an agreement, and even if it is satisfactory, the fact that it is only part of an overall agreement that won't be reached for another year, year and a half, whatever, means that there will remain uncertainty for all those citizens concerned both ways round, because at the end of the day, if there is no deal, then this risks falling as well. Now, is there a way around that? Can this be ring-fenced and put in a separate legal agreement? We've raised this with Monsieur Barnier, with the Commission, with others, and the answer legally is no. The Article 50 refers to a single divorce agreement. But that should not preclude both sides making a political undertaking that they will respect whatever agreement is reached on these subjects, if one is reached on these subjects that is satisfactory, that they will undertake to respect it come what may, and enact it by other mechanisms should there in the end be no Article 50 deal. Now, we all say, well, there will be a deal. Let's not be complacent. There are some people in the United Kingdom, indeed some ministers, who don't want a deal. They want Britain to leave without an agreement because they think any agreement will, as they see it, entangle Britain in the single market and its rules, and also I think they fear the citizenship rules as well. That's why they want a hard cliff-edge Brexit to end all ties with the rest of the European Union. If they succeed, it will be, of course, a catastrophe, not just on this front, but on many fronts, for everybody, but in particular for the United Kingdom. But those on the, shall I say, the hard Brexit wing of the Conservative Party are actually, in my view, trying to secure that outcome. There's another dimension, by the way, which is highly topical. This afternoon, the House of Commons is debating the question of the Charter of Rights and whether that should be kept in British law, even if Britain goes ahead and leaves the European Union. And there is an amendment down to, on the related question of citizens' rights in terms of keeping the consequences of the Frankovich judgment of the European Court of Justice, which makes a national government liable when it has not properly enforced the rights that are enshrined in European law in its own country, and there are individuals or economic operators who have lost out because a member state has failed to apply European law correctly, and the Frankovich judgment says that they are entitled to ask for compensation from the government of the member state concerned. The British government wants to make it explicit that the Frankovich judgment is disapplied, no longer applies if the UK leaves the European Union. And I think that's another issue, and it's yet another one which shows ill will from the current British government. So it is a rather bleak picture, I'm afraid. It's just one of many aspects of Brexit that we were never told about at the time of the referendum by the Leave campaign, who said, oh, all these problems, we no problems at all, don't worry, etc., etc. But these problems are stacking up, they are mounting up, and I think the British people are discovering day after day more and more Brexit problems, more and more issues that they kept quiet about. The Leave, the Brexit people, supporters, kept quiet about before. And yet the evidence is piling up that Brexit is a highly damaging, negative thing for the UK and for citizens across Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Scholz? To you. Just to ask you, do you have something written that you can leave to us of your speech? So because we had no time to list all the problems. So
no,
we know,
I think
we know, but it would be very useful to have your both your list and your speech.
Yes, we can send them.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. And as this meeting is web streamed, I would switch to German because I guess this question is not only affecting British people, but I mean all citizens in the EU 28 have to understand what we are speaking about, and that the question of the citizens' right is a prerogative for the further development of the European Union.
So I want to make clear that I'm extremely grateful for the presentation from the NGO representatives, because I've really seen your commitment and passion that you bring to this particular question of all these people who are directly affected. Over 4 million now directly affected by what's happening. And what I want to say here at this point once again is that for the European Parliament, as you've seen in our resolutions in October, that the citizens' rights are not a point of negotiation. It has to be absolutely clear that the political positions, the political explanations and support for the European citizens' rights have got to come to a satisfying solution. In the group, we had a meeting with Michel Barnier last week, and as the group, we made it very clear that there need to be more positive steps from both sides before we get to Brexit. That means that the citizens' interests and the status of Northern Ireland have got to be absolutely in the centre of the decisions as to whether or not there can be peaceful and proper progress inside our negotiations. We have to have those commitments before we go to the second phase. And so this is the question that we need to discuss. Who decides, and when do we decide what significant progress is? Who takes the decision? And of course there is a degree of negotiation positions there from both sides, of course. So you've said very clearly here that from the European Parliament you expect an absolute clear statement of where we are and the importance of citizens' rights before the Council that takes place in December. We have to make very clear in the Parliament about what we actually expect in terms of significant progress before we get to some kind of conclusion to this controversial phase one. And I think for me and for my group there can be no stepping back from that. We need to know what is required. And citizens' rights, the status of Northern Ireland, and also the financial bill have got to be analysed before we go to the next stage. And I think it's extremely important that we do have some benchmarks. We need to have benchmarks in order to know what we can say as the European Parliament, and then we need to assess whether or not we can allow it to go further. And I think that's in the interest of the 3 million, and it's also in the interest of the British in Europe. Because you need to be able to start preparing for your future plans. I want to make it very clear that Brexit cannot call into doubt the citizens' rights. That's an absolute key issue. It's difficult. It's difficult when you look at the result. If you take the result as the starting point of negotiations, I know it's going to be difficult. It's a British position, and the European Union has got to take into account that the UK want to leave the EU. We have to start from that point. And of course it's true that Brexit is going to have a negative impact on the lives of a number of people. We have to be absolutely certain that Brexit in itself doesn't have a negative impact on those citizens. And it's a very complicated context that we're working in. These issues all hang very closely together in our group, and I'm personally committed to this. We're going to keep working to ensure we get as much information as we can from you, from your websites, from the European citizens in the UK and UK citizens in Europe, so that we know exactly what the situation is, so we know where we are. And this is in order to ensure that you can also have access to information to maintain the debate in the UK. The debate has got to keep going also in 2018 as we move into phase 2. And I think we're going to continue to talk about the issue with you and indeed amongst ourselves.
Thank you, Helmut. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Jauregui.
Gracias, Presidenta. I will speak in Spanish if you want. Yo querría...
I want to start by saying that I fully share the importance of what you've brought to the table here today. And I want to say that I know there is a very strong movement in all our countries, but I particularly know that it's in Spain by the European citizens who live in Spain, who have exactly the same concerns that you've expressed here, and indeed the mayors of a lot of Spanish towns where there is an important 400,000 British people live in Spain, particularly during indeed the winter months in a lot of Spanish cities, especially on the coast, that there's a strong movement amongst these mayors and these people to support you. And I think that's an important resource in this battle, and thank you very much for having energized yourselves to form a civil society and come here and talk to us. In this Parliament there is what I would call basically unanimous in terms of defending what Mr. Schulz has said and what Richard has said. It's a common position for all of the political forces. It's not easy to get this Parliament to agree with each other, but on this particular issue, oddly, there is practically, I would say, there's unanimity around the table in terms of the defence of citizens' rights, both of the 3 million and of the million. So I think you've got full agreement amongst all of us, and I think I have to tell you that very strongly. There's a conviction as well that the different representatives from the different political parties brought together under Mr. Verhofstadt, who represents the public negotiation, have this as a starting point, as a core point, defending the equality of the rights of the citizens with comparison to the previous situation. Full commitment to that. A couple of months ago in this very committee we had a number of experts, and they came to talk to us about the acquired rights. And unfortunately the report of those experts actually said that there weren't any acquired rights in the context of Brexit. They were looking at international jurisprudence who was saying that, yes, that actually they can't be infringed because they don't as such exist. And this is something which actually goes against something that we're saying here. Now, this leads us to a point that the negotiation has got to establish a new framework, a new legal framework for your rights. Not the previous rights that you had, because they don't exist. That's a very important thing to say, that the Parliament has got to establish and has got to set it down inside the agreement that these rights exist and what they are. So you've got a withdrawal agreement, then you'll have a transitional agreement, and during that process the UK will remain the customs union, or the single market rather, for 4 to 5 years. That's a key moment for you, and all of the groups in the European Parliament are going to defend. They may not all be here today, but I can tell you in the name of everyone, of all the groups that I know, perhaps they can't all be here but all of them think pretty much in the same way. What Richard's saying, what Helmut's saying, what I'm saying at this moment in time, we all share that starting point. It's important that the final point of this long process is going to be a long process. It's going to be a long battle, that at the end of that we have to look at a European Convention on Human Rights as, if you like, the possibility of going to the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, that is the legal space that you want to see, because that is what will guarantee you the full respect of your citizens' rights. And I think that's the end result. That's the point we're trying to get to. But as I said, it's a very important battle, and you're fighting it well. You're doing a good job via your initiatives. And quite humbly, I would say that the European Parliament is absolutely standing behind you all the way.
Thank you. Now, Mercedes Bresso.
Grazie Presidente.
Thank you, President.
I miei colleghi hanno già detto quanto.
My colleagues have already said how much the Parliament, there's not many groups here represented, but my colleague has stated how we are all committed to the defence of the citizens' rights. I think you've seen that in the resolution. It's been said, I think, with great clarity. Recently, I was in Manchester and in London, and I was meeting representatives of the 3 million, and I have to say that the more I listen to you, the more worried I become, because the number of problems, the number of issues that are coming out from a whole range of different situations, it's huge, and it keeps growing. It affects more and more people, and this is extremely worrying, because either the agreement is an agreement which is what one of the two of you said here is that actually these rights are not going to be touched by Brexit and you'll be exactly the same as it was before, or on the other hand, what will happen is that there will be possible deviations and changes and infringements which will actually break that range of rights, and the devil is in the detail. The current status of British citizens in Europe and European citizens in Britain are going to, if this happens, this is going to lead to an ongoing range of conflicts and problems. And this is where jurisprudence, which may seem as not being so important now, begins to be very, very important. Jurisprudence will be key at some stage. If we get a good solution, then it would be extremely difficult to come up with a solution, I think, that covers all possible cases. There will be jurisprudence that is going to be used on a legal basis on an ongoing manner. And this is, as you say, it's the lives of millions of people. And I think we do run the risk of having uncertain situation running over a long period of time, which will have an impact on families over a period of time. So I think we need to try and make things as simple and as clear as possible. And above all, we've got to make it clear to everyone, to all the stakeholders, all of the interlocutors, that we have to have an honest and broad interpretation of the rights. We have to have a situation that covers these huge numbers of people in jurisprudential terms. We still don't know which court would end up deciding, of course, on these issues, but we have to be absolutely sure the jurisprudence forces the administration, both European and British, to apply the legislation as fairly as possible. It's also important that this looks at the issue of the freedom of movement, because people are in different 27 member states, and one of the important issues to negotiate is to ensure that their own citizens have got a good agreement when it comes to the situation in the UK. I don't think any of us could imagine that each of you in a different member state would have no right to free movement. You have to have movement across Europe, no matter which country you're living in. And a final point, as I say, I become ever more worried, as indeed I think Richard is, by the risk that there is no agreement. Because if there is an agreement, well, there may be some problems with it, but the core of the rights are going to be protected. But if there's no agreement, well, then the situation is really serious. And I think, and we as a parliament indeed have got to start thinking about how we look at this, how we imagine this, how we contemplate this. If there is no agreement, how do we nevertheless ensure there's at least a minimum of rights guaranteed, even under the hypothesis of there being no agreement? And that begins to worry all of us now, I think. At the beginning, I thought it was going to be a question of details, but it may be. It won't even be a question of detail. It may even be a question of a situation which is extremely complicated, very difficult. Now, I know you've got suggestions, you've got ideas, which we're not thinking about at the minute, but we have to at least bear in the back of our mind this hypothesis, be ready to think about it, because we mustn't find ourselves unprepared. Time is passing, and there's not a lot of time left indeed. And our job is also to ensure that if there are real difficulties, we also have got to have a coherent negotiating position. There's this kind of back and forward at the moment where we get the impression the UK doesn't always know what it wants. We have to have, well, the interlocutors on the other side seem to be changing their point of view a lot. We need to have some consistency in negotiations. That's extremely important, and it's very worrying, the possibility we may not have an agreement. This currently is my biggest concern. Jurisprudence is very important. That has got to be fair. There's got to be a commitment on the part of the administrations who actually implement the decisions to manage the decisions that are taken in a manner which works in the favour of European and British citizens, not against them. In other words, not in favour of the national administrations, but in favour of the British and European citizens. And this in substantial terms, not just in terms of, the words they use. Thank you, Mercedes. I might just take the floor because there's nobody else down on the list. Sorry for the fact we're running. I was a little bit late because I was caught up in a different committee. So perhaps some things have already indeed been said. I want to ring the alarm bells, actually, on this issue. on the rights of the citizens. Thank you very, very much, our friends from British in Europe and the 3 million. Thank you very much, because you're waging an extraordinary battle. And it's a precious battle for the entire Union, not just for you. It's precious for all of us, because this is a question of rights. And it's a question of the freedom of movement across the Union. So, alarm bells? Why? Well, on 2 points. First is the question of sufficient progress. We know this situation is complicated because the negotiators want to make it complicated. We know that when it comes to citizens' rights, what sufficient progress would be. The negotiating responsibles have said that Brexit should not change the nature of daily life of citizens. And so the consequences would be to act in relationship to that statement. What they're negotiating on the moment, however, is the issue of settled status, which is proposed by the United Kingdom. And this is an inferior status in comparison to the status which you currently enjoy as members of as EU citizens inside the UK. So we're talking about procedures, whether they're faster or slower, whether they're more or less reliable. But we actually should be saying, is it consistent? Is it coherent with what was said at the beginning? Or are they trying to change something in terms of the status of citizens? So sufficient progress is the first point. And I am afraid that in this very Parliament, the small part of this Parliament might end up deciding that there has been sufficient process, when in fact there hasn't. So it's not given that all of us will be behind you in that point. And the second point is a question that I want to ask from British in Europe and the 3 million. And this is about a fight which I was waging with you from the very beginning, which is on ring fencing, which is ring fencing of citizens' rights. The use of the idea of protecting them from the rest, a carve out from the rest of the negotiating. So you kind of have them cut out so they can't be touched. Now, the problem is that we need to understand what ring fencing can actually mean. And this is my second alarm bell. I begin to think, listening to Barnier, that there's a certain number of rights which they are preparing to negotiate on in the second phase of negotiations. In particular, the question of free movement of British citizens inside the Europe of 27, the situation of cross-border workers, the recognising of skills and qualifications. What I begin to see is a danger. I see a danger that there may be a number of rights that have been ring-fenced thanks to the withdrawal agreement, and then there'll be a range of other rights. These are rights which will be up for call, and they're going to be discussed in the framework of the negotiations on the future trade agreements. So that's my significant concern, that you're going to find some of these rights are going to be dragged over into the second phase of negotiations. And I think this is also key from the point of view of the wording that's used. What kind of ring fencing do we want? We want everything under the withdrawal agreement. What things might end up being pulled over into the second phase. Maybe you've already discussed this today. Maybe you've already brought those issues up. So in which case I'm not actually talking very usefully, but this is something that continues to worry me. So it's the exact definition of ring fencing and what's covered by it. Thank you. Are there any other comments around the room? Any other MEPs? Helmut.
Thank you, Chair. I want to come back to the remark of Richard when he said, besides all the legal issues we have to analyze and to take into account what the negotiation teams will achieve, etc., 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 we as the European Parliament should aim on a political statement, agreement, where we are clearly expressing from our side what should be the benchmark, if I understood you correctly. So that we, besides the negotiations, need also a political statement of the European Parliament, where we are accompanying the issue. The two sides maybe is not enough because they are in the negotiations, but the Parliament must be very clear in saying and formulating precisely that in the phase one, the citizens' rights must be the prerogative, so that they are not switched between the different interests. And I think such a statement, political position of the European Parliament would be very important for both sides then to agree. So as you say, the alarm bells are ringing. It means we have to speed up our own understanding what we are speaking about when we are speaking about this red line which we expressed in our resolution in October this year. And the second proposal or issue I see as important, that the definition of the sufficient progress should be legally cleared in a certain way, if it is possible. So can we ask our legal service to give a certain hint in which direction sufficient progress, which is a political terminus, as interpreting where we are, is linked to the expressed lines we have taken as European Parliament in our resolution concerning the Brexit negotiations.
Yes, Helmut, I think there is not a legal definition of sufficient progress, I'm afraid. And it will be a political decision. So, but anyway, I would like to give the floor to our friends who would like to.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So thank you for your support that's been expressed here. I think we're very grateful to hear it after some of the meetings and some of the comments that we have had over the past few weeks. I think what's crucial to state is that we share your concerns about the possibility of a finding of sufficient progress, because where we are sitting now, the 3 million and British in Europe, we don't think that we're anywhere near touching distance on sufficient progress. So for us, this is not something that we would want to see at the UCO on the basis of the current offers on both sides of the table. So I think we'd like to make this point very, very clearly to the Parliament. We take on board your point about ring fencing. There has been a lot of discussion about the importance of having jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice and direct effect. But the question remains is if we get those, and we should get those, and we absolutely support that we get those, but you have to have direct effect for real rights which are meaningful. Yeah. If we only have direct effects in jurisprudence from the courts or referral possibilities to the court for a very small number of rights, then it's not really particularly helpful. It's better than nothing, especially in the event of a no deal. But what we want is direct effect and ECJ protection for both the 3 million and for ourselves for the full set of rights.
And I think we started off thinking in May when we saw the EU offer that we would get pretty much what we have, or that's what we wanted, and it's what we still want. And I think I'll just finish off by saying I live in Luxembourg. I'm from the north of England, but I now live in Luxembourg, where we have a national motto, which is we want to remain as we are. And I think that that is very much the position that we want to be in, and the position that we hope we will be in with the support of the Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. And now somebody? No.
Okay.
Okay.
Just to say that I do totally support what Fiona has said. You know, it's very much our lives are at stake now. 23,000 EU citizens have left the UK since the referendum. I think those figures speak for themselves. A lot of people, when they leave, they don't necessarily go back home. For a lot of us, going back home has no meaning. I have lived in the UK for 31 years. The UK is my home. A lot of citizens we know have moved somewhere else in Europe because they feel European and they want to continue to live the European project. This is really important, very dear to us. But also, some of these citizens, when they leave the UK, they take away their businesses. Some of them are taking their stuff with them as well. So that's a great loss to the UK. And we also see more and more British citizens leaving the UK. It's not just us EU citizens leaving. I think a lot of people a lot of British citizens are feel that they are European citizens as well, and they want to live in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Laure. Jane has not.
I would just add that I obviously support what both Anne-Laure and Fiona have said, and I just want one more time to reiterate what we said about working people who have gone out and made their lives based on their EU citizenship. And it's not just a question, I mean, we really have taken our rights and done far more with them than the founding fathers expected. We did not just move from one country necessarily into another. We moved to several different countries, and we do see ourselves as European, both groups. And I just want to reiterate that again.
Thank you. And now we close the work. No. There is
It's finished.
yes. I must announce the next meeting, the ordinary meeting on Tuesday, 28th of November, at 9 o'clock until 12:30, and then in the afternoon at 15 until 18:30 in Brussels.
It will be 14:30.
Goodbye.